Good morning. It is April 14th, 2025, and I'm going to do a longer version of the print that we did in Ephemera, where we used various printing and overprinting techniques. And then we're going to try something a little different using some of those techniques and also a resist. So let's turn on the camera and see what happens. First thing you're going to need is a few book pages trimmed down to just the print block. How many is a few? Well, it kind of depends on what you're using for your base layer. So if you're using 8.5 by 11, 5 or 6 should do from a standard size beach novel, but it may vary a little bit. And it also depends on whether you want to keep the titles and the page numbers or not. I didn't. And so I think I used 6 pages and I cut all the margins off. Then I cut the text block. Your goal here is to have enough paper to basket weave over, under. And you'll see in a minute that I cut my text block the short way. I probably shouldn't have because I had to glue 2 or 3 end to end to make the weave on the long side of the 8.5 by 11 paper. So I probably would have been better off to just cut them all the long way, but for whatever reason I didn't. I cut them the short way. You're going to end up with strips that are an inch wide. You can make them as wide as you want. Let me say that. I chose an inch wide just for easy math. And once I get all these cut out, I ended up with little scrap pieces. The margins I actually used by cutting them down to make the lattice work in the previous video, which you saw us replicate Madame B's lattice work portrait gallery. So now I'm ready to lay these out on a base sheet. It can be any paper. It doesn't have to be plain paper. It can be a piece of scrap paper if you have scrap paper that's full size laying around. Now, you start at the top by gluing just the top edge, and you'll see I make a mistake here and have to peel it up. Nevertheless, you're only going to glue the top edge just a scant 1/8 of an inch. And you're going to choose whether you want to space them out. I chose to space mine out an inch apart roughly. And that means that the paper that is the base paper, it happens to be grid paper, will show through in different spots. If you use this masterboard directly in your project, if you photocopy it like I did, then that grid may not show through. Now you see me gluing down that second row of book paper, and I make sure that all of my text is going the same way. In other words, all of the writing goes from the bottom to the top. I don't worry about whether the writing makes sense or not because you're going to end up with little squares of writing anyway once you do your over-under weave. But for right now, we're just laying down the warp of the weave. Now, we've got our weft also in my left hand. Weft goes from right to left. And what we're doing is going over, under, over, under. I have anchored with glue my warp on top, and then I anchored my weft on the left-hand side. These are little, lines of glue. They're not gluing down the whole piece. If you glue down the whole piece, you can't weave it. So here we go. At some point, this is really hard on your eyes. So you have to really be careful and pay attention to what you're doing. And at some point, I messed this up twice. And I fixed it, and then somehow I got it messed up again. Don't ask me how, but I did. And I was a weaver for about, 10 years or so, but doesn't matter because unless somebody really looks at it closely, they're not going to notice it anyway. And you'll see me looking and checking again and again and again, over, under, over, under, over, under. And as luck would have it, now that we're close to the end, I see where I messed it up. But let's not get hung up on that. Let's just keep going and get it finished. Because the next thing we're going to do is make photocopies, which I talked about briefly in the Ephemera, the library case Ephemera episode here 2 episodes back. We're nearing the home stretch here, and it ends up still being messed up no matter how many times I went back and corrected it. But for the most part, it turned out successful. And even though I know I messed it up, I kind of don't care because the object here is just to get a basket weave pattern. And like I said, once you photocopy it and use the photocopy for other things, it kind of doesn't matter. And of course, I pull things out of line and all that jazz. But eventually we get to gluing down the right hand edge and the bottom edge with little lines of glue next to the margins. And that holds it down. We don't do any gluing in the center because we want this piece to float so that if it gets knocked out of line, it will naturally right itself. And even though the weave pattern is incorrect, the whole thing stays as I put it down just because I let it float. Let's glue this little top edge here from the last strip I added down and do a little glue surgery because, just like camera stopping, glue surgery is in every video. Then we'll glue down the right edge and the bottom edge. After that, we're going to the photocopier to make some copies. By the way, if you're new here, thank you for joining me. This channel is mostly DIY. And in the beginning of the year, in January, I do a lot of papercraft because I participate in Junk Journal January, which is now over. But you can go in my playlists and find January Junk Journals playlist and see what we did this year for Junk Journal January 2025. If you're old here, I'm always happy to see you. If you have comments, questions, suggestions on doing things more efficiently or, a technique that you have tried that you think other people would be interested in, by all means, tell us about it in comments. So now we're on the home stretch of gluing all this nonsense together. And I cut out a lot of this and I speed these things up because while I want you to see the mistakes that I make so you won't make them, I don't want you to watch me fiddling around with weaving paper for 20 minutes. Now we're at the point where we're cutting our excess off so that our finished piece is 8.5 by 11 again, because that's the size paper we're using for the journal that we're working on, our library case, where we have a finished journal cover or partly finished journal cover. We have a 2-signature working journal where that's the journal that we do all of our work in. It only holds 1 or 2 signatures. And the point of that being, I don't have to sew all my pages together and put them in my final journal. I can put them in this working journal, leave them all loose, and then I can switch pages around or do other things with them and don't have to commit to a layout until the very end. It's a concept. We'll see if it works. Once we get this last little bit cut off, we're going to go speed ahead, and you're going to see some of the clips that you saw in the printing ephemera part from 2 episodes ago. And I'm going to abbreviate those clips since you already probably saw them. Here's the original masterboard that I made with some bad ink splotches, and I couldn't find the masterboard to reprint it. So here's a black and white copy of the one we just made. That's why I remade it. And then here is a copy that I put a piece of wax paper on the glass and then put the copy on. And I got a more muted print, which is what I was going after. I took one of the muted photocopies and edged it with just what was on the brush of my shader to give it some faux foxing. Next, we used some stamps to make some overall prints on top of that, and got some mixed results. It was the first time I ever tried this printing technique. I use Stays on Black because it dries very quickly, and you can add more techniques like sprayed distress ink and other techniques, and the Stays on will not smear or bleed. And I wanted that for this technique. So basically, you need a faceted glass jar or drinking glass, and you ink up a bunch of random small stamps and roll the stamps down over the page like you're seeing me do here. I don't leave the stamps on the page very long, and that is counterintuitive to printing. Usually, it's not the pressure you put on the stamps to get the ink to stay. It's letting the stamp with the ink rest on the paper for a few seconds to get this ink to soak in. So even though it looks like, you're putting a lot of pressure on the stamp, when you place it down, that's not how stamping works. It's the amount of time that the stamp has to be in contact with your paper, allowing your paper to absorb the ink. And I got mixed results with this, as you can see. In theory, this technique should work really well, but I think you have to use a wetter ink than Stays On. Stays On, as I said, has a reputation for drying really fast. If you use a wetter alcohol ink, or certainly in the case of an oxide, you need to let it dry very thoroughly before you do anything else. Now, because I use Stays On, I can spray alcohol ink over it. Other inks might bleed and might smear. So take those things into consideration. I kind of left you hanging in the last episode where we worked on recreating Madame B's lattice work portrait gallery. So I just wanted to throw in at the end what I ended up doing with it. I took a stencil and I used a combination of faded jeans, distress ink, and rustic forest, or rustic wilderness, sorry, distress ink, and added some decorative border along both sides. I took that print over to the printer and printed on the back side our woven book page, but I put a piece of tracing paper that has the same grid pattern as our graph paper and put that on the glass first. So there is a slight grid pattern. It's very faint. You can't see it on camera. Then I folded it in half. I'm not really worried about it since it's a photocopy and I'm not using the original for this part of my project. I folded the little scroll work back and I made side tucks for it so that you have two front and back pages that have side tucks, and it opens up to a center spread that has that Madame B's lattice work example, our example. Since none of our pages and our signatures are sewn together yet, we have absolute freedom to mess around with everything. And that scroll work border looks very nice against the first page of one of the folios. So I swapped them out. That's the whole point of having this working journal, so that you can swap things anytime you want to. And it looks really, really nice against it. So here are the final shots of the two, the outside, the way it looks against that green stripe, and then the inside when you unfold it. Now I'll let you in on a little secret. This particular section that I did Madame B's lattice work for a portrait gallery is actually going to be some family things for a gift. So I'm going to be working on this section a little bit. I'll bring you along whenever I can. But I think for next Sunday, which is Resurrection Sunday, we will have no show. But on the following Thursday, so a week and a half from now, we're going to evaluate what we have already in terms of folios and ephemera and ideas for the different folios, what those sections are, and start working more focused on each section. If you've never tried overprinting on your prints, it's worth a shot because it opens up a whole range of possibilities, and we haven't even talked about oxide inks or dyeing or anything like that. I wish you a blessed Resurrection Day and Passover season. God bless you, and I will see you in a week and a half for a Thursday episode.